Welcome to Brain Ponderings, your window into the wonderful world of brain science, conversations with experts in their various disciplines within fields of neuroscience, psychology, and all that entails. I'm Mark Mattson, the host. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Maryanne Garry. She's a professor of psychology, security, and crime science at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. She's an expert on memory, false memories in particular, how we process, retain, and recall information, and how what's going on in our brain may change over time or depending on the sources of information, how many times it's repeated, and so on. And so she develops ways to empirically test hypotheses that address some of these questions. And that's in contrast with anecdotal evidence or um, this kind of hearsay evidence, I guess. So scientifically validated evidence. So welcome, Maryanne.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so before we went live, you mentioned to me you're from New Jersey and
Oh,
You're in New
Mark.
Zealand now. So can you explain what happened that you ended up in New Zealand?
Well, recently I've started telling people that I was just really prescient. Uh, but in, but in
Yeah.
fact, what happened is that I was doing my postdoc at the University of Washington in the early 90s. And this was when, I'm sure only you and I remember this now, but Newt Gingrich was doing his contract for or on, depending on who you were, America, and instrumental in shutting down the government. And I was on a federally funded grant, and the UW, even though it had a lot of money and knew that the money was going to come back, said, "Oh, we're turning off everything." So I couldn't pay anybody to be in my research projects. I couldn't photocopy anything. There were photocopiers, right? I couldn't do anything. Couldn't make a toll call. I couldn't do my research. Turned off my salary, turned off my medical benefits. It was mayhem, and that happened twice. And that was, at the beginning of the calendar year. And academic jobs aren't posted then. They're posted towards the end of the calendar year.
Oh, wow.
So I thought, I need to get out of here. What am I going to do? I need some stability. And, it's just so happens that other parts of the world hire when they feel like hiring. And I saw in one of the psychology trade papers that which is what you had to do since there were about 300 websites in the time I'm talking about, that there was this job in New Zealand. And I don't even know, actually, I'm sure I couldn't even found New Zealand on a map back then. But it also just so happened that an undergraduate who was in the lab that I was working in had just come back from doing an exchange there at the same institution. And she said, "You would love it. It looks like Seattle." And I'm not sure why I took the word of a 20 something. But I just applied on a whim, just a complete whim. And I thought, what's the worst that could happen is I hate it and I use my credit card and I leave. And that was in 19, I moved there in 1996. Not to this
That was
university.
at Wellington, is that right? Victoria?
Yeah, at the
Yeah.
Victoria University of Wellington. And I was there for 20 years. Um, I loved it. I loved it there. And they had a change of administration that I did not love. So I moved up here to the University of Waikato, where my a guy I really respected became what in American terms you would call the president of the university. And so I've been here since the towards the end of 2016.
Okay, then your early, so what, right, and before you were at University of Washington, you did a PhD at UConn, Connecticut, is that right?
Yeah, the University of Connecticut. Yeah.
Okay, and so was your PhD thesis research related to your postdoc or to what you did in
It
Washington
was
and Seattle?
misinformation, the extent to which experts are protected from misinformation. Uh, and, the answer is sort of if it's in their area. But being, for instance, a scientist doesn't make you globally skeptical no matter how much you would like to think that it makes you globally. I mean, maybe it does, but it doesn't give you the ability to then stray out of your area. This is going to shatter all professors everywhere, right? It doesn't give you the ability to stray out of your area and detect misleading information and accurate information in other areas.
That's interesting. I don't know why, but I was always kind of guess you'd call a Renaissance person. I kind of keeps interested in all sorts of different areas, mostly within science. And that's actually served me very well. We've done research on everything from intermittent fasting to Alzheimer's disease to related to the brain, not all of it. But yeah, it's actually really good to dig into the literature in different areas because it can give you ideas about your own area in addition to
Oh
just
yeah.
learning things.
Yeah, for sure. I think, thinking like a scientist gives you an approach, right? So you would probably, in the face of some claim, think, I'm going to go do a
Right.
literature search, right? And you would know how to look at the statistical, the design and all of that kind of stuff, more or less, right?
It's
But it's
interesting
still,
how the lay public here in the United States, my impression is they've never even heard of PubMed or, other, sources of the original research articles, of review articles, of meta-analysis. They get all their information indirectly. It used to be not too bad. It would be through reliable reporters and, a few networks where, they all check it. And now, and you can talk all about it. I'm kind of rambling here, but now we've got all these seemingly to me random people, these so-called influencers, and and we'll get into this later because I want to, get up to the present time. Yeah, it's really a problem.
yeah, I taught a class last year that I'm about to teach again this coming trimester, but the class was about identifying fact for versus fiction, all sorts of scientific claims, for instance. And I noticed two things, and one is that there's a pull away from just science, just general distrust of science. And you see this in the rise of what's sometimes been called science populism, which is that scientists are out to line their own pockets and it's just their reality and all this. Okay, so there's that, which I found really distressing. And the other thing I found really distressing is that if you ask in this class, when I ask students, well, where do you get your news from? Your sources of facts, and they say their friends or social media. So
Yeah,
they're just a victim of the last thing they heard,
yeah,
right? And if
yeah.
you ask you or the professor I taught this course with or whatever, it's like the New York Times or, something and multiple sources. No, not them.
The interesting thing, though, if you think about it in other aspects, like a car mechanic, right?
Yeah,
Uh, for the most part, people trust them. They take their cars to them and they fix their car, right? They don't go to a doctor or a lawyer to fix their car. And so it's kind of strange that they would not go to the scientific literature or to scientists to try to understand whatever it is they're trying to understand.
right. Right.
Yeah.
And you also don't go to a car mechanic and say, my car's making this squeaky noise. And then they say something about what it is. And then you whisk your car away and go off to, that's just your opinion. And then take it off to another mechanic. And that doesn't usually happen.
No. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, I'd like to go through some specific studies you've done. And as
Hmm.
background, can you describe what is source monitoring
Yeah.
in the psychology literature.
Well, right. So there's this related idea, source monitoring, reality monitoring, but let me just kind of collapse them, even though if Marcia Johnson is listening to me, she's going to be angry. Uh, so the idea is, as I always explain it to students, we have to have evolved to have a way of pretty reliably, effortlessly distinguishing between what's happening now, really, what I'm imagining, what I dreamt about, what I read about, right? Or else you would live in this world of total delusion.
Yeah.
And if this were, if we hadn't evolved to have these abilities, then I mean, we wouldn't even be here, right? You wouldn't even know if you could step off a curb without being hit by a bus. Like you just wouldn't have any idea. So, uh, and then as part of that process, we also have probably evolved to uh, learn to trust some sources of reality more than others, right? So I probably have learned to trust, as probably most people have, I've probably learned to trust what I see more than what I think I dreamed about, right? And that's basically it in a nutshell. And clearly, most of the time this works right. Most of the time it's fairly effortless. You would all, I mean, everyone has this awareness of times when it's more effortful, like a lot of people, and I'm definitely one of them, have sometimes confused a dream with reality. So there's this interesting phenomenon I've discovered in which sometimes people will wake up and be angry at their partner for what happened in a dream, and then even knowing it's a dream, it has this residual consequence.
Oh,
So it's all that kind of thing. And, did I do that errand I was supposed to do? All that kind of, all of those are challenges to reality monitoring.
and
Uh,
we evolved, in small groups like, my understanding is hunter-gatherer type, I guess you'd call it kind of nomadic type lifestyle. There's small groups, maybe 50, 100 at the most individuals, and they're related, and so they grew up together, and they're exchanging the same information and sharing that, and then I guess comparing it to what they actually experience in the environment and learning from that, and those from that sense we've evolved too fast in terms of information overload, and a question arises, can our brains handle it?
yeah. So a lot of, you just alluded to the fact that a lot of this reality monitoring and source monitoring is social.
Yeah.
It's efficient to be social. But yeah, yeah. You often find these when there's a change in when a new technology appears on the horizon, you often find that a society bifurcates over how it's going to handle this. Maybe not bifurcate, but is divided over how it's going to accommodate this new technology. Typically, and its impact on social groups, right? So, for instance, when the telephone came out, you can go back through old articles like in the New York Times and see them screeching about this is the death of social, just getting together and talking in person. What's going to happen is, and they actually screeched about we're going to have a generation of gossipy housewives who are deaf in their left ear, right? And eventually these kinds of things tend to shake out for good or for bad, and so I don't think I mean, there's some evidence that the telephone had these pernicious effects, but it also, to the extent it did it's probably outweighed by, making it easier to have social interactions, for instance. Um, but you're right. There's there's this period of at a minimum being unsettled,
Yeah.
right? This instability in society and how it's grappling with the technology. So yeah, as things as information comes on the scene and we're flooded with information from news sources that we don't really understand how to evaluate in a framework of source monitoring or reality monitoring, I think it causes problems.
Yeah, and again, since who's it, Dunbar, the Dunbar number, right? That you know about that? The okay, uh, non-human primates and humans before the agricultural revolution, the evidence suggests they could maintain significant relationships with no more than 100 to 150 other
Oh, right.
individuals, meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
And that is just completely, now it's got, so our social brain is not geared to handle all these potential social interactions.
Yeah. And then also, a lot of them are synthetic. They're not real, genuine social
Yeah,
interactions.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
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 And what about, so the individual, there's individual reality monitoring, but there's also intergroup reality monitoring. Could you
Yeah.
give an example of that?
Yeah. So, uh, the idea that comes a lot from Grice, but also supported by research, is that we mostly assume that other people are being helpful and truthful. Right? Mostly, that tends to be what you default to, and you can see, like based on your example of how we came to be evolving in these small groups, right?
Yeah.
So uh, you'd have to assume that the people that you're with are reliable, helpful, truthful, all that kind of stuff. So, and as a result, we take certain markers as signals of this helpfulness and truthfulness. So, for instance, we assume that people who are confident are credible and accurate. They know more, they're more trustworthy. And if you think about it in the group, the person in the group who basically said, I'll go get us dinner, and then ventures off into who knows where, and then comes back with a big, like, elk, right? That person has a bit of bravado, but often it pays off. So they get awarded higher status by the group
Mhm.
than equally competent but less confident counterparts, right? Uh, and of course, the problem is that people who are overconfident tend to be the ones who make bad decisions, right? So, in fact, we all tend to have a bit of not all, but we often tend to have a bit of overconfidence. And so confidence itself doesn't distinguish, for instance, between true memories and false memories in some situations. So, and a lot of the problems with, and I'll just use this one example, wrongful convictions, like people who are later exonerated by DNA analysis or reanalysis, uh, often you have a very confident witness who says that's the guy, sometimes multiple eyewitnesses who have, in the mean, taken away 14 years of somebody's life for something that they didn't do. So that's one thing. Um, uh, and so we accord, and that's a major thing. So we accord people this default status. And although it probably served us well when we had limited ability to make these connections, as you say, let's say you have 150
Yeah.
meaningful relationships. These days, you can have these relationships or receive information from people who do not have your best interests at heart, right?
And they're
Who are going
strangers.
to
They're
be,
not family members. You didn't grow up with
yeah,
them.
right,
You've never been exposed to them,
right, right,
ex
right,
ex
right.
except through the little, whatever interaction is on social media.
Right. So this is when my students say that they just will go with whatever they see on social media, not whatever, but like where do you keep up your news? Oh, yeah, like YouTube. Really? Right. So you don't know these people. You don't
Yeah.
have any, they're not specialists in this particular area necessarily. There was a time when we could pretty much get on board with the fact that if you wanted to know what was going on and have something, some information that was trustworthy, you'd flip on CBS News and watch Walter Cronkite.
Yeah. Or NBC.
Or
Yeah.
yeah, right. But something.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and uh and now. everybody's a journalist, you know? And now we're talking about fake news and all, and so there's far fewer reliable sources of information that we can go to outside ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, all right. So let's see, repetition versus, what about this idea that just repeating something over and over or getting exposed to the same information over and over uh, makes you more likely to believe it,
Yeah.
even if it's false.
Uh, there's this really interesting uh, set of related findings in psychological science, and they show that when some idea, some information springs to mind more easily, we evaluate that thing uh, along many positive dimensions, right? So, for instance, if I'm doing a task and the task it feels easy to do, regardless of whether I'm doing it accurately, right? If the task feels easy to do, I think I'm better. I think I have a lot of skill relative to if the task is difficult. In some situations, if the task is easier, I can answer, again, regardless of whether it's accurate or not. If I can do the task more easily and it feels easy to me rather than feeling difficult, I think that you, for instance, as the instructor, are probably better than if it's difficult. So we take easiness as a sign of good things, and we take difficulty as a sign of danger. And you can speculate about all manner of evolutionary reasons for that as well. So one of the things that's a big kingpin in this area, Norbert Schwartz at USC likes to say is, if you have walked into a clearing and you see a cave, like if you're a cave person, you walk into a clearing and you see some creature and it doesn't eat you, then the next time you don't have to be vigilant about that thing, right? So you can devote less processing power to it, mental processing power to it. And that's the idea of fluency. So fluency feels less effortful. So probably over the course of our lives, the idea is that we develop so as to associate easiness with good and difficulty with danger.
And then
Uh,
this ties into then the heuristic versus the slow effortful reasoning.
yeah, it can,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it would be this heuristic that something feels easy to do.
Yeah.
You're an expert, I'm good at what I'm doing. This is, all this kind of stuff. And when it comes to information, so you can this is a reasonable heuristic, I think. It's a reasonable heuristic. But you can also find, as with many heuristics, ways in which it goes off the rails. And so one of these ways in which it goes off the rails is if you repeat information, then it's like seeing the creature again that I don't have to pay attention to, right? So it comes to mind more easily when information is repeated and it feels more true with subsequent repetitions. And so you can probably map this on in a nanosecond to the problem with fake news. So maybe the first time something comes out, people are like, maybe, and then it's repeated and it gains currency.
Yeah. And there's really bad things gaining currency in the States now, right? And the one is the events on January 6th, the
Yeah,
attempted coup, and they're trying to essentially rewrite uh, history by repeating falsehoods,
yeah.
and then this eventually, if things keep going on, it's going to end up in textbooks in school.
Oh, yeah, in Texas, in a millisecond.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so you've got these compounding of the problems we were just talking about, right? Which is you're repeating things that aren't true. And what you're doing is asking people then to rehearse a version of the events that is not true, which crowds out the version that is true. And then there's this general skepticism, even if you were to say, look at the video, of course what you'll see is people saying that's fake.
Yeah, now we'll get to AI in a little bit, but yeah, okay, now you really got me worried because you can have
Yeah, sorry.
we have fake AI generated photos, right? Or
Yeah, yeah,
Photoshop, and there can probably in not too long be fake videos and
yeah. They're
yeah,
here. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Now, way back in 2012, I guess you had this paper in Active Psychology where you looked at, repetition versus the number of different sources of information. How did you go about experimentally testing this?
Uh, well, what we did is we asked people to read the statements. So these were fake witness statements about something they had witnessed, and they either read repeated statements from attributed to one witness or the same statements attributed to three different witnesses.
Huh.
And it 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 turns out, like you would maybe think, and this is reasonable, that if you three different people converge on the same idea, that you've got some consensus. And consensus tends to be associated with reality. Not always, as we were just, January 6th notwithstanding. Um, but what we found is that even if you attributed the statements to one person, so one person just banging on saying the same thing, like the annoying person at a faculty meeting who just won't be quiet, right? That tends to have the same impact on people as three different people each saying that thing once, which is kind of alarming. Now, what's the mechanism? It's probably a fluency mechanism. It's repetition. So it's repetition can outstrip the source.
And also the emotional context, if someone raises their voice and bang, and this is something I notice over and over, right, with this social media influencers, they're always, you know, like they're angry and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's the typical thumbnail on YouTube is like, here's 10 things they don't want you to know.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the thumbnails are, oh my gosh, yeah, it's crazy. Maryanne, um, I, I'm not on Facebook. I was never on Twitter. And because when these things came out, I had a huge lab at the NIH, and a lot of students, postdocs, other scientists, and I just said, I don't have time. This is gonna be a waste of time. Um, but the other thing is the emotional thing. The social media, the way it's designed, it amplifies the emotion, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, right. And I got on Twitter early, back when there were a lot of just academics and ordinary,
yeah,
professionals, and then other random people started coming on, and it was, there was a time when it was fun, but I was never one of those to be on it all the time. Uh, but it alarms me the extent to which, and I see it in my own lab, right? It alarms me the extent to which people are always, they have a millisecond free and they're scrolling on
yeah,
one of these things.
yeah.
Or worse, when things
My
get hard, that's what they do.
my kids are doing that too. I'm semi-retired now. I write and read your papers and other in the morning, and then I we have a granddaughter, and I kind of goof off the rest of the day. But I even find myself now that in the when I'm not focused. So in the morning, I'm like complete quiet time for like 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's something that's missing in these kids growing up is quiet time just to think and contemplate things and think about different things because it's just now it's from one thing to another and maybe
Yeah, I know.
they
I
never
know.
get the big picture
Right,
right.
right,
Yeah,
right. I think thinking, and contemplation is important for consolidating. Well, first of all, it's important for consolidating information, as you know, in your brain. But it's also important just to maybe step back and get the big picture of, as you were saying, of
yeah,
of things and really deep problems.
yeah,
But I think what they do is they go to boredom because they don't know what to do at that time. And then they're just, shh, 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 shh.
Yeah, and it becomes
Yeah.
kind of like an addiction, I guess.
Listen to us. We're like old people yelling into the wind.
Yeah, I guess so. So let's move on. Okay, then another paper that I saw that was pretty interesting to me is that uh, something that you call retracted memories, or
Yeah.
it's the idea that you learn something or experience something, information that's stored in your memories, and then later you learn, however reliable sources or whatever, that no, that's incorrect. But still, that information for the false information is still there.
Yeah, it is still there. And so the question is, uh, does it do anything or does it just sit there? Like when it comes to mind, do you think, oh yeah, that's not real, right? And then you must, right? Because you think, okay, well, I don't believe in this thing anymore. I don't really believe this happened. A lot of people, d depending on, well, I think in this paper that you're referring to, I think we have maybe 25 to 40% of people can talk about an event that they had, typically as a child, that they came to realize never happened.
Uh,
And fine. And these kinds of things are utterly common. And so what happens then when you remember it? You think, okay, that didn't really happen. Uh, or do you think that didn't really happen and it still affects you in some way? And the answer is it still affects you in some way, right? It tends to serve some functions that are helpful and harmful, which I just think is fascinating. So its memories are not always inert, right? Even the ones that you would think would be like the equivalent of an inert gas aren't. They still, when they come to conscious awareness, when they come to top of mind, they can influence you in some way. And that way can be good, which is great. And the way can be like not good, which is, maybe not great.
yeah, and they affect your decision making, which is kind of in some ways, the bottom line of what we've been talking about is ultimately what's important is the decision that the person makes based on real or false information.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So what we showed in there is that this belief is kind of off the table. It just doesn't really matter. If you don't believe a thing, it doesn't stop it from having some impact on you. And I'm going to be like hesitant I'm making big sweeping causal statements when we don't really have, causality here because it's not truly an experiment because people are ponying up with their own memories, right? So we don't have all the control I'd like to have, but I think it's a pretty good collection of evidence. And then what we also showed in there is that the extent to which you get this rush of reliving this, sometimes when you have a memory and you bring it to mind, you get this feeling that you're right back there reliving it. So that's also related to these functions. So it's not the belief, it's probably the feeling that you're reliving it when it comes to mind. Now, whether that means you relive it and then you have to stop yourself and go, "Oh yeah, that's not real," or that we don't know.
yeah, the reliving's in it. I do that a lot. I actually some of the best days of my life I remember when I was like high school age, and I had a friend, me and him used to race motocross,
Oh yeah.
dirt bikes, and then my father and grandfather and me and my brother trained and raced harness horses, trotters and pacers.
Right, right, right.
Actually, New Jersey at the Meadowlands is probably the place where there's the most harness racing left in the United States. But anyway, I remember those things, but I'll go back to like a specific motocross race in my memory. And, I think, now, did I finish third or no? Was that the one I crashed in? Or and things like that. Or there's this other interesting phenomenon, which maybe it's a good thing for your self-esteem, is I think people kind of exaggerate exactly what their accomplishment was,
Oh yeah, for
you
sure.
know, and
for
You know,
sure.
the fish you caught gets bigger and bigger as the years go
Yeah,
by.
yeah, yeah. That's right. And we also tend to just globally, this is some interest. I didn't do this work, some other people do this work, but really interesting phenomenon where you tend to pull successes into your current, identity. This is me today versus, oh, the old me did these things where they failed.
Yeah,
And that's a psychologically healthy thing to do. So
yeah,
this thing where we exaggerate our wins, the fish and successes, uh, to some extent, as long as you don't turn into like get some psychopathology about it, is a good thing because it gets us out of bed in the morning.
yeah. Motivation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, collective memories. So this is very,
Right.
very timely. Wow, yeah, it's yeah, I bet it's very interesting on textbooks, for example, right on the history of countries. Uh, they don't always accurately reflect the history, or at least they de-emphasize negative things and emphasize positive things. But this collective memory, can apply to not just countries, right? It can apply to your in group, whether it's a religious group or
Yeah,
your religion, your political affiliation,
right. Just
and so
collective,
on.
a group. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So collectives, whether they're countries or religious group, whatever, uh, you know, people they have stories they tell themselves about themselves.
yeah,
And then so you can speculate about why, but and other people have, you know, tried to take an empirical approach to answering some of the why as we did as well. I think it's most studied, and then this is what we did at the level of countries. And so you can see it in the US, right? And you can see the shift now. The US has a story, it's starting to tell itself about itself. And there have been people who always have told these stories about the US, and now they're more prominent than maybe other people would have been a few years ago, right? Other versions of history. And what you say about history, and it's so true, and you can see it very clearly in the fight over textbooks.
yeah,
So I'm sure you know this, but maybe a lot of people who listen don't know this, but in the United States, there are, states pick their own textbooks. Sometimes communities pick their own textbooks, and some states just say, well, you can only pick from these approved textbooks that we're going to vet. And as a result, there are two very big states, California and Texas, who do this kind of thing, and they skew the textbook market for everybody. And as you can also imagine, Texas and California do not agree on what should be in a textbook on a lot of dimensions. And so you can see Civil War is described differently, Reconstruction after described differently, the post-World War II white flight from the suburbs, not described like that in Texas, for instance. And so so the idea is that you're really going to shape a generation of children who then become adults into thinking, here's what my country's about, and what's the function of that? Well, one possibility is that these collective memories you have. Oh, we haven't even defined that, right? So we all have these individual memories, and different countries, groups, whatever, will have their own collective memories that they think are important events in their country's history. And they have this event-like character. So it's not just a fact, right? It's got this event-like character. So for instance, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? Right. The the start of the Revolutionary War, the attacks at 9/11. right? The election of Obama. These are some of the important collective memories in the US. And there tends to be broad agreement about that. And different countries have different ones, right? So I'm doing some work now to see about to determine collective memories. I'm doing that with some colleagues, collective memories in Japan, for instance, right? So they have their own collective memories. And so the idea is that we set out to determine is are they serving the same functions that our own personal individual memories serve? Our own personal individual memories of events, autobiographical memories, serve three broad functions. One, and not all of them do, they do to various extents, right? One, some kinds of these memories will tell us about who we are as people. They serve these functions about our identity, help to forge our identity. Second is they help to guide our future thinking and behavior. So we call this a directive function. And the third is they serve a social function. So they may be things that we talk
Yeah.
about when we're with other people. So they help us develop and maintain social bonds. And it turns out that co collective memories about countries serve similar functions. What I'd really like to do is see what happens if you ask someone from one country to talk to a person of another country,
Yeah.
because that would be a really interesting thing. But we took a first step, which is just to say, ask people, you know, to what extent is this the kind of thing that would, this event about your country, tell you about, does it tell people or you about your country's identity? And so on, is it the kind of thing that you would talk to with other people? Does it guide your country's future thinking and behavior? I personally think this directive function about guiding future thinking and behavior is really, really important because that, I think, it's one thing to say, this is who we are as Americans on identity function. And it's another thing to push on the social part too about, we're all going to vote for this guy. This is who I am as a person, part of this collective, this tribe, this political tribe. And it's an entirely other thing to say something like, for too long, Europe has taken advantage of us, right? And so we must act.
Right.
That's a whole different bag of chips. So you can galvanize people to do things that are good, right? Come, people put on your mask, get your shot, and let's look after each other. And you can galvanize people to do things that are bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that directive function, I think, is the most dangerous in the hands of a skilled politician.
Yeah. Yeah. This gets a lot of the scope of our conversation, I guess, or maybe what you're doing is, but you have individuals who have, they like power, right? And they like to be able to control people and have a lot of people under their control, whether they're head of a corporation or companies or, you know, whatever, senator, president, and so on. And so they're, it's maybe a mixture of intentional skewing of reality or, spreading misinformation essentially, and for a purpose. And maybe some of it's, in some cases, some individuals or some of the information, they really do believe what they're saying. I'm skeptical about the latter in many cases.
Hmm. And you can see how that could be used for good, right? A really effective leader
Yeah.
can say, come on, this is who we are. We're going to come together. We're going to get through this. We're going to do blah, blah, blah. Uh, I think here in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern did that for a really long time with New Zealand's response to the pandemic. And
And also the gun violence, right? What that was New Zealand, right? Or was that
Australia
Australia?
mostly. It was
Oh, it was
Well,
Australia.
Australia did it better.
Oh,
We did
okay.
something after the shooting at a mosque a few years ago, which
Okay.
was good, but not as, I don't think as good as Australia's.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, surely when the prime minister said we're closing the border, they knew it was illegal. It was later determined by the Supreme Court that you can't do that. You can't keep your own citizens from coming back into your country. And they just omitted a bunch of information because they thought, well, we got to get people on board. And so that probably saved a lot of lives.
Yeah.
And they appealed to, we're a team of 5 million people. This is the New Zealand way. We all pull together in a crisis. We've done this before, pushed on probably a whole lot of allusions to New Zealand's response in World War II and other kinds of, things that just push on the whole New Zealand psyche. And yeah, for a long time that was effective, and until it wasn't. But there are also obviously people who start out talking about these kinds of things, knowing that they're not true and using them for their own purposes.
Yeah. I was thinking about sports teams, right? You're, you sound like a coach on a sports team there. We're gonna work together for a
Yeah,
common,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
but there's another sports team that you're competing with, right?
right.
And you're
They're
the
getting the same
goal,
talk.
yeah, it's like, and that's kind of what I think's happening in the United States, that except on a very serious level, you're getting divisions where, the equating one sports team with a political party, rah, rah, rah for this team, and we're going to beat the others. But in this case, it's serious stuff that
Yeah,
is affecting people's lives in bad ways, potentially.
yeah. And I think when you start losing your collective memories, or they, fade into, a distant past, uh, psychologically, then they become much less effective. So, there's this work that Michelle Gelfand has done showing that countries that have these very relatively tight cultures, think of Taiwan relative to the US or New Zealand, which has a relatively loose culture, or, South America, which has tend to be much even looser cultures. Tighter countries have this, it means that they have these stronger views about what range of behaviors are acceptable, and a feeling like we're all more united than countries that are looser. And so she's made this connection
Hmm.
between, like, these tighter countries tend to have had more frequent and more recent environmental threats, natural disaster threats, health threats, and so on. And so you can see, for instance, it's not like the US and New Zealand or whatever didn't grapple with the pandemic of the early 1900s, the so-called Spanish flu, right? We all did. It's just that we let it fade away, and well, that's just old school. It doesn't even, that kind of nonsense doesn't happen anymore. Whereas Taiwan, for instance, got slammed with that bad flu virus, and I don't know when it was, the last bird flu, right? So 2009 or 10 or something. I'm totally making that up. But as a result
Was
of,
that the bird flu or the first SARS?
yeah, I think so.
The first SARS? Because I
Yeah.
went to Taiwan like a year after that, and
Oh,
everybody was wearing masks
yeah,
still.
right. So when was that?
It sounds about right. 2009, 10. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was their response? Their response was everyone's wearing masks. They had grappled with natural disasters before. They have nonstop threats from China to their, existential threats and so on. So they wore masks. They closed their, I don't know what they did to their borders, but they set up what is still, and it served them well during the coronavirus pandemic. They set up surveillance at the borders.
Yeah.
So people who would come in and out of the country are scanned. It's tied in by computers. It's tied into their version of the CDC, and they check your health records. Everything is all happening and automated, and it's just, and they responded pretty well to the pandemic.
Yeah,
Whereas in here
it
in
didn't
New Zealand,
spread. It didn't spread beyond Taiwan.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. So it was really good, and so it served them well because they had this collective memory of like, oh, when we do this kind of thing. So I think that, relatively speaking, they did pretty well
yeah,
during the
yeah.
coronavirus. I mean, they didn't unscathed. Whereas in New Zealand, we didn't have this collective memory of that useful collective memory. What we had is where we can pull together, we can do this kind of thing. And until when that stopped being useful, people were like, screw it, right? And in the US, you didn't have anything you could pull on, right? It was like all states' rights, yada, yada. We're all independent. We all just,
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's get to so that the reason I came across you and your work because like every month I look at review articles in prominent journals, you know,
right,
Nature Reviews journals or Trends journals, and I saw your Trends in Cognitive Science paper from last year on essentially artificial intelligence, large language models, and how they designed to exploit weaknesses in people's reality monitoring. I guess
yeah.
yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, if you go back to what I said um, earlier in our conversation, we assume our conversation partners are trying to be helpful and truthful, right? So the problem with these large language models, many of them exist in the form of chatbots for the average person with cause, right? I mean, I'm not going to get in there and open up my terminal and start banging on some download a LLM to my desktop. And most people aren't going to do that. So they exist in the form of these chatbots, and there's the problem in the word chat right there. There's the problem. So we assume that the people, as I said earlier, the people we're chatting with, we default to assuming they're being helpful and truthful, right? What do we know about these chatbots, about these LLMs? Well, first of all, they are confident. They never say, I'm not sure. I mean, every once in a while they might say, you should go check this because I'm a large language model. But mostly, you know, they're confident. And it's not just they're confident. They tend to be very good at promoting the illusion of knowing all sorts of things and sifting through all sorts of things to return an answer to you. So they're confident that they have sifted through these things and returned information to you. As these models have evolved, they've tended to do things that feel like they're thinking out loud, right? So they'll say things like, I'm thinking, right? ChatGPT does this, thinking, translating, checking, right? Uh, are they doing anything like that? I, I don't know. I don't know. Right. So, like, I have a Mac, and just a few years ago, I learned that the progress bar on a Macintosh is nonsense. It's just there to pacify you
Oh yeah.
so that you understand that something's happening. Right. So,
I also
is
notice it's not linear. It
yeah,
doesn't.
I know. And then it just goes,
Yeah.
right, right, like an aha moment or something. So when something like ChatGPT says it's translating and figuring out and adjusting its responses, is it? Or is it just like the progress bar on a Mac? Like, I just don't know. And then the other thing is when it refuses to answer, uh, it sounds often like it knows, but it's just not telling you. Like, which makes it more of an authority figure. Like, I know, but I'm not going to tell you. Right. Like I asked ChatGPT, I couldn't find the instructions to some medication I'm taking, and I just wanted to see something about it. And it said, I can't give you that advice. It didn't
Oh,
say like, I
but
don't know.
maybe that's like uh HIPAA regulation, or
Oh,
maybe.
I'm sure it's a kind of don't sue them.
But it isn't one of the biggest problems is that what what information are they training this on? Because it's not taken from scientific, well, they have scientific literature, but it's mainly taken like whatever, books, newspapers, uh, pretty much anything they can get their hands on that's in the public domain. Uh,
I think they have trained some things. Well, probably PubMed, right? Things that they can find in PubMed. I don't know if they've been on Sci-Hub. It wouldn't surprise me if they've been on Sci-Hub. They had a whole lot of torrented stuff that they trained. I know the Meta Llama model on. Yeah, yeah. And so the problem is, this is a reality monitoring, source monitoring problem. So, and it's what you alluded to earlier, which is what's happening in the technology is outpacing how we've evolved to grapple with it,
yeah,
to assess the credibility of sources and so on. Uh, so we've always had situations in which we've encountered people who've made mistakes, whether it's people we know really well or just other sort of people. But this scale is unprecedented, right? Just the fire hose, the proverbial, as they say, the fire hose of it's just a flood of stuff. And the second thing is uh, errors are baked into these models, right? So there's this really nice paper in Nature by Zhou and colleagues last year that these models prioritize accomplishing their task, doing what you ask them to do, sometimes,
uh,
uh, than being right. And as they put it in that paper, they prioritize looking diligent by saying something meaningful at the cost of being wrong, which is just it's a beautiful expression, right? And they do make mistakes, right? So they make, I don't have updated figures, but at the end of last year, they were making something like conservatively 1.7 million errors every day, about 20% of which we had estimated were deliberate in the sense that I hate this anthropomorphizing in these models, but this is the computer
yeah,
science language, right? In that the model knows it's not correct, but gives you the answer anyway, because they're prioritizing being helpful over being accurate.
yeah.
And so this combination of factors leads to who knows what consequences, right? So you could say, um, sometimes these errors are inconsequential. Like I could ask it if it knows if it has here's some things I have in my refrigerator. Apparently people do this. Here's some things I have in my refrigerator. What can I make for dinner? And it just makes something up that's rubbish. I mean, who cares? It's just but if it starts telling you things that are fundamentally not true about the world, including about history, then, or it has a slant, that's a problem. Like, I don't know if you saw J.D. Vance's speech slash rant in Germany. Um,
Yeah.
but when he said, among other things, that we're going to continue to advocate for basically LLMs that don't have an ideological tilt. Well, they already do have an ideological
Yeah.
tilt, right? So you can find that, uh, and there's research on this, that ChatGPT has much more of a kind of libertarian tilt, perhaps slight right of center tilt about the world than does Gemini. Uh,
Hmm.
and it's not just how they were trained, it's probably how they were tuned. It's probably how they handle the reinforcement in the model.
What's the Chinese one called? It's
Deep mind? Is
yeah,
it deep?
DeepMind. That would be interesting to compare that to the others.
Yeah,
And
I haven't played with deep mind. I'm just a little
yeah.
wary of like, no thanks. I'm not going to download a Chinese large language model to
One
my
one
desk.
problem, the way you ask the 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 AI the question can determine the answer. It's like if you have a bias, unconscious or conscious bias, you may ask the question in a way
Yeah,
that gives an answer that it more conforms to your preconceived
yep,
notion of what the answer
yep,
should be or is.
yep.
Yeah.
So it looks like they return answers differently depending on first the language in which you prompt them,
Mm.
because it makes assumptions about who you are and what so subcontext, that's a context cue, the wording of the prompt, and then um, just the model itself. Yeah. So what you find, OpenAI, for instance, at least at the time of this paper that I read, was more critical of welfare policies, more critical of the EU, more critical of multiculturalism, and something that might come under the banner of United One World, and Gemini is more writes favorably about the rights of workers and social justice and so on. So, you know, I actually laughed out. I mean, I rolled my eyes several times at that speech, but I laughed out loud when I heard him say we're, this free of ideological slant or whatever it was he said. I was like, too late.
Well, everything he said was ideologically slanted, pretty
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
Pretty much.
yeah. Pretty much, pretty
He's
much.
trying to promote the right wing in Germany.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
clearly.
yeah, one aspect, so kids growing up now, but we talked about this, everybody knows about this now. They're on their cell phones and kids don't get out in nature much anymore, right? Uh, some kids can grow up in a city and maybe hardly ever get out in nature, and I think it's important for people to get away get away from people, be out in nature and try to get a little better perspective on the whole world rather than the what's going on in the collective brains of people throughout
Instagram.
the world. Huh? Yeah,
Instagram. Yeah, and at the same time, they'll also spend too much time at home, s- on,
yeah,
on social media, right?
yeah.
So it's the balance of social interaction and getting out in reality that I think is a real problem. Uh,
And not enough physical exercise. It turns out physical exercise is probably the best antidepressant, the best thing you can do to calm down, think more clearly. And let's, at least in the United States, fewer and fewer people are getting enough physical exercise. And
yeah.
we evolved, moving through our environment, thinking while we're moving.
Mm.
And for me, like a lot of my best thoughts come when I'm walking or running, or even on the stationary bike for a half hour, and with no other input. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is one. So the question is, um, what can be done about the rapidly developing issues we've been talking about that seem to be maybe causing a lot of problems for individuals, groups of individuals, countries, maybe the world. Um, Ideally, education is kind of a good way to address it, but how do you, I think that somehow you have to have some group with power, like in some institutions, develop educational tools to teach people, uh, particularly kids as they're growing up, what are the best ways to get accurate information, to evaluate it. Things like I talked about, taking time for critical thinking, even reading books. I notice a lot of kids don't read books from, cover to cover anymore.
No, they don't have the attention span.
Yeah.
Well, I I go back and forth between thinking that what we have to do is, well, make these chatbots less fluent, right?
Uh,
So add a little bit of friction. Adding a warning, which a lot of them have now when they return certain things, like you should check what or in tiny print, you should check what I'm telling you. Uh, Warnings don't do much. You'll encode the misinformation. Well, let's just say you'll encode the information, and then what what am I supposed to do? Take an extra effortful step to unwind it. And most people don't do that. So I think that So I don't know the answer. And there are other much smarter people working on this area, including a couple former students of mine who are now in Australia. I think they're really grappling with some difficult problems. Uh, and the other thing I sometimes think is at least you should know. Like at some point, you just have to understand the scope of the problem and maybe understanding the scope, the extent to which these things can be wrong. Maybe that will help.
Yeah.
Uh, like, I don't know about you, like, I will use one of these LLMs to help me work on some code. And when code doesn't work, you know it doesn't work, right?
I've never coded. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I,
Well,
I'm
if
I'm
I'm gonna,
com maybe this is a good thing for me anyway that I'm you know I mentioned I'm never on Facebook or Twitter. So the only communication I do is pretty much email or
okay.
Zoom like we're doing now.
Right, right, right.
But I
So
yeah,
if I'm trying to write some code to get my, yeah, it's like a terminal command and it's just above my, brain power, or some R code to do some, data analysis or to look at a graph differently or something. I will often, because I can't be bothered figuring it out, I'll often be like, oh, I want to do this, blah, blah, blah. Here's the code I have, it's not working. And they're like, oh, right, well, it'll go, oh, you should do this. And lots of times, what will happen is I'll try the code it suggests, and then I'll get a new error. Come back. Here's my new error. Oh, I'm sorry. I must have. So we'll go back in this loop. And I would say maybe a third of the time I leave being really irritated and thinking I'm going to look for plan B because you're not helping me. But other times it actually is really, really helpful and at least gets me over that hurdle. And then I hit a new roadblock. But the point of all this is that when it's not working, you know it's not working. So you know when it's wrong. If you're using it to write some code and the code is broken, it
yeah,
won't work,
yeah.
right? So you get the feedback right away. So I have this very love-hate relationship with these things. So I'm like, are you going to code or are you just going to make some nonsense that's not going to help me? But that doesn't necessarily it. I think that it engenders some skepticism in me, but it doesn't give me tools then for when I'm asking it something else, like, oh, as I did the other day, uh, what here's a picture of my dishwasher. This part's broken. What is it?
Oh.
And so it told me, and I ordered the part. Is it the right part? I guess I'll find out in a few days. Right. So could be yes, could be no.
In the
But for some
meantime, you have
reason,
to wash your dishes in the sink.
yeah, that's the indignity of all of that's the real tragedy here, Mark. So I guess really I trusted it enough to be like, okay, well, I don't know what part it is. I don't feel like having a repair person come out and paying them $150 just to show up and go, oh, you need this part. I'll just try it because that was much cheaper and just seemed expedient. But you know what I mean? So like I like you, I'm probably more skeptical than your default person, but I'm still willing to be like, okay, sure, and try a certain thing, right? That's outside of my area. Um, so uh, my concern then is the people who don't run into anything with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, where anything sets off their spidey sense going, well, look, I know this area and that's just not even right. That's not even close to being correct. I find ChatGPT is legitimately terrible with math, just basic math.
Huh.
And I always pay for it when I have it do something like add up these numbers. So sometimes I use it to help me do my university credit card accounting at the end of the month. And I always tell myself, I'm never going to do this again. Add up these receipts, and it'll just add up some of them. Uh, and I just wonder what will happen with people who are routinely asking it for information and they don't have the awareness to know that it's not true. So
Yeah.
an expert's going to be skeptical in their expert area, but maybe less skeptical not in their expert area.
So is the
I don't know.
LLMs maybe somewhat better than social media for getting information, but um, and there's no like Chat GPT's free. Is there any with the social media? They people make money off of it, the information sources, and most of the time you have no idea where they're getting money, who's sponsoring them. It could be
Yeah.
somebody with an angle or wants them to present things in a certain way. Um, so what do you think about reliability of information on the LLMs versus social media? It must be better on the LLM.
I think it is better. Yeah. Um, because if you if you go with the idea that there's, I don't know, it's still true, that there's more true versions of a thing out in the world than there are false versions of a thing. So like, what's the temperature of at which water boils? You'll find more instances of that that are true, that are accurate, than you will just random 87 degrees, right? Just and so that should mean that to the extent that it's scraping the world, it'll be more accurate. Now, that's fine, but that's not the danger. The danger is that when you don't know and you think it's accurate and it's not accurate,
Yeah.
because if you're hitting like over 1 million errors a day, that's a problem. And I'm sure as you've seen this work yourself, it's a relatively small number of people who are responsible for sharing and resharing
Yeah. Yeah.
falsehoods. But
Yeah.
it does enormous damage.
Yeah.
And it's only a matter of time before these then get propagated back into these models, and the models are like, it's what's so-called model poisoning, and they're all working with each other and
Are they
absorbing each
taking,
other's fat.
they're taking things off of Twitter or X now?
I don't know. Well, Elon Musk one is for sure. I don't know about it used to be much easier to scrape Twitter, X, whatever, than it is now. So I suspect old stuff, yeah. Reddit, yes. So you can see, like, for instance, OpenAI has done some content deals with various sources.
Hmm.
And I don't know if Meta has. I imagine maybe they have. But they've all scraped things illegally.
Oh
Like
yeah,
they,
it's all most of it's copyrighted stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And, sometimes they make this legal argument that, well, if you can read whatever you want, then our models are just reading. They're just reading really fast. And so, you could go get something illegal. We're going to go get something. So,
Well, that's like me, whatever. Uh, let's see what this is kind of a minor thing, I guess, but downloading a PDF of some article that's not publicly available yet, and then sending it out to millions of people on,
right.
I don't know, would I get in trouble? Maybe not. I don't know.
No, I mean, in fact, a lot of people would think you're a hero, right? This is the
Yeah,
premise
that's
of
true.
something like
That's
Sci-Hub.
that's true.
Uh, yeah. I saw an estimate not that long ago that about 5% of the content in Wikipedia is supposed to be generated by these large language models. Not supposed to be, is estimated to be generated by large language models. So there must be errors in there. Now, you know, to the extent that we've eye rolled at Wikipedia from the day it was launched and advised students not to use it, now it's just getting more of a problem.
Yeah.
So I think,
They have financial problems too, I think.
yeah, they do. They do. And all these um, people often say, well, like, can't we have some content moderators? And you're like, well, yeah, you see from recent events, nobody's interested in content moderation, which gets conflated with free speech.
So you and I had Encyclopedia Britannica,
Right.
right? And that was pretty, I think it's pretty accurate information in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I,
I remember distinctly sitting down for hours and just kind of paging through there and reading stuff, looking at stuff.
that's what I would do.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to go back and look at how things in the 60s or the early 70s were portrayed about, like for instance, the civil rights movement. Sometimes they use this spectacularly passive construction, as you
Mm.
might like war broke out as though it just happened,
Yeah.
like measles. Uh, but where we've arrived at now, where we have multiple competing versions of reality and not good tools for identifying what is true, and the breaking down or the massive mistrust in institutions that we've traditionally, for a long time, given the job of doing this specialty reality monitoring, journalists, scientists, government agencies, watchdog kind of entities, schools, right? There's a really dangerous time that we're in which nobody trusts anybody anymore. And then what happens? Then we're all walking around with different versions of reality. And, in its own way, that's what I alluded to at the beginning, this kind of delusion where we can't tell the difference between a dream and what's in front of me and what I read and what somebody told me.
Yeah.
They all are on equal footing. So you just pick
Okay.
one.
Well, on that pleasant note, maybe we should finish the podcast, and I will when I put this up, I will in the description section, I'll put links to your some of your papers we've talked
Oh,
about
great.
and
Great. Thanks.
to your lab webpage.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
Maryanne,
All
thanks.
right. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.